Okay, here we are on test 307, talking about the reading and writing side here. So my name is Rio. If you haven't seen me before, I am our humanities lead over at Hamilton Education. So I made most of our SAT tests, and I make the test review videos for them. You may have met me teaching any of our classes or in tutoring. So. Yeah, we are going to go through every single question for this test 307. They'll be separated out so you can click through to find which one you want to uh, review. And I'm going to go into each one and try to examine or explain some of the baseline skills and things you can do to improve on these on your own as well. So thanks for joining us, and we'll get right into it here. Question one here, we have a word and context question. Okay. Um, so we want to make sure that we're understanding what kind of word needs to go in this place as opposed to just what word sounds good here. Okay, so what we want is a word that says um, it sounds very inspired by the band The Velvet Underground, or in the style of the Velvet Underground, something that says that this band is an influence on the style of this band here and this songwriter here, and to do it in a way which suggests some sort of negative connotation, okay? So, a very compelling distractor here is reductive, all right? Because it can sound like it reduces this, but when things are reductive, it means that they are restricted to only one element, okay? So for example, sometimes when talking about economics, they can say that people are either like reductive to, or maybe social issues. Sometimes they'll say, oh, you are being an economic reductivist, right? Meaning you're explaining all these social issues only using economics, which to me actually kind of makes sense as someone who got an econ degree, but that might not be correct. You could say, that it's reductive to say that struggling on the SAT only is because students aren't reading enough right now. Even students who read a lot maybe can have some trouble on this new SAT because of how tricky and silly the College Board is. Okay. Uh, Derivative is what's correct. Okay. You might think of derivative only in the form of, say, what you do in calculus, right? However, to be derivative in the kind of cultural context is to make yourself out of something which came before, right? To kind of copy something, which actually makes sense when you think of it in the math context as well, right? But here, basically, it's saying that to be derivative of the Velvet Underground is to derive or to create much of their own image or sound out of something that already existed before, right? Lou Reed, the greatest of all time, and the Velvet Underground, the greatest of all time. Uh, Inductive, okay. First, let's think of what, it means to induct, right? That means to include something in. So when you're inducted into a club or into a Hall of Fame or something like that, that means that you've been inducted in. When things are inductive, it's typically talking about reasoning, though. Okay. So inductive reasoning is like basically when uh, you look at like specific situations, and then from that you make kind of like a bigger law. Okay, so you look at all sorts of stuff, and then you say, you know, um, like I've seen that it's kind of like you take a particular instance. I do uh, my most recent cross country race or my most recent test. I drank coffee before it, and I did really well. And then from that specificity, you then do it in all the general. So anytime I'm going to do something academic, I should have coffee before it. Finally, captive. You could be captive to things, and that would kind of sort of work here. But remember, This is a prepositional phrase here. Captive of the Velvet Underground would mean that the Velvet Underground has literally captured them and has them like locked up in their basement, right? That doesn't actually make sense. Okay. For the same reason, you would never say, oh, I'm going to spend 2 hours driving at Los Angeles today. You would say, oh, I'm driving to Los Angeles today, right? Even though at makes sense logically, it's something we wouldn't say. That's because it's an incorrect prepositional phrase, which is why captive is wrong here. So that's how we get to derivative. All right, question two is a tricky one here because it's probably a word you're not too familiar with in this context, okay? So this is something that the SAT loves to do. They love to give us words where you think that their meaning is probably something else logically, but in fact the meaning has accurate or like a fitting definition in here. Okay, so glacial, you might think just has to do with when things are glaciers, right? But a glacial pace is really common, okay, to describe something that moves really slowly. And if you think about it for a little bit, it's pretty straightforward, right? A glacier moves really slowly. So the pace of a glacier means it's a very slow pace. All right, so we see that in the passage. Remember, you have to read the passage to understand what's going on here. Okay, what does everything lead up to, right? Uh, is frustratingly slow, right? There's all these things that they have to go through. Um, Sluggishness, okay? Uh, so we see all these words that are suggesting a slow pace, and a glacial pace is a slow pace. That's exactly what it means. It's how it's used. If you got this wrong by choosing something like judicial or official, I'm worried that you're only reading this sentence, okay? And that, in that sentence, it might kind of fit the context. It might kind of mean something that makes sense. But when you read the passage as a whole, you can see that this pace here isn't saying the like governmental pace of change. It's saying the slow pace of change, right? And judicial doesn't mean slow. Official doesn't mean slow. Okay, you need a word that means slow here. So if you're not reading the whole passage, you're going to miss this by choosing something that sounds good, but doesn't mean what we're looking for at all. All right. Agile finally is pretty off the base here. If you kind of flipped the logic of this, right? So like, uh, this is agile, right? Expediency is agile. Executive decrees are agile, right? That's sort of fast, easy to move, like a cat hopping around. All right. Um, if this is what was being criticized, then that would work. But we're talking about the legislative politics, which remember is up here, is frustratingly slow. All right. So make sure you're reading the whole passage to see what is going to determine our word in the blank. All right. Glacial meaning slow. Even if you didn't know what glacial was, you should probably be able to get rid of judicial, official, and agile. All right, question three here. If you missed this one, I worry that you either didn't do your best to try to solve what these words mean if you didn't know what they meant from the the get-go, or you didn't read the passage as a whole and you just looked at the one sentence and tried to find our answer, okay? Um, so if you read only till here, the passage doesn't clarify what this word really needs to be, okay? If you stop at the word increases, you're gonna get the wrong answer probably. Why? When asked in polls, people across all socioeconomic classes express frustration with rising prices. Okay, everyone's upset about rising prices. While upper class individuals may voice concerns about inflation, their spending habits belies, okay, meaning reveals an actual something toward price increases. Okay, so if they're frustrated with rising prices, it could be, uh, they maybe just don't know about price increases. It could mean that they are unfamiliar with them. It could mean that they are really happy with them. It could mean that they're really unhappy with them. Right? There's all sorts of things that could fit before the word increases. We need to see what the study says to know what kind of word needs to go there. Okay, so let's read the study. Studies show that even during periods of high inflation, consumption of luxury goods, okay, high-end groceries, and travel expenses fluctuates little among wealthier consumers, okay? So even as prices go up, spending habits don't actually change at all for rich people. In contrast, working class individuals tend to adjust their consumption patterns significantly. Okay, so when working class people complain about high prices, it's because it actually changes their life. When rich people complain about high prices, it seems, according to this study, that it doesn't change their life. It's not really clear why they express frustration. So, in their actual spending habits, their actual day-to-day life, we see an indifference. Okay, so what does indifference mean? Me da igual in Spanish, right? Uh, it doesn't matter in any sense. It's equal, right? Uh, Indifference doesn't mean that like there's uh, well, it actually kind of means that there's no difference, right? It doesn't mean that they're not different. It means that they're uninterested or it's not impactful. It doesn't have it's insignificant. Okay. Um, so they have no strong feelings in terms of how they spend, even if they voice that. Okay. These other ones don't fit here, right? They're not ignorant of price increases. They know that they exist. They're complaining about it, but they don't do anything about it. It's not like they haven't experienced it. They clearly have, but they just don't care. And then finally, tentativeness. I mean, they're kind of like, uh, like I'm just not quite going to do it. Okay. And being tentative here isn't seen at all, right? When you're tentative, it means you're kind of like not strong in your opinion or not strong in your decision. Okay. So that's how we arrive to indifference for question 3. All right, question 4 is, in my opinion, our first actual hard word and context question of this test. Okay. Um, it's not just tricky or anything like that, like maybe some of the other ones were to some degree. This is actually a word that's hard to know. Okay. So we probably have heard of the correct answer, constituents, said by politicians at some point in our lives, right? Like you can protest against your congressperson or whatever by saying like you're not representing your constituents. Okay, what is a constituent then in the political sense? So we might think it means people who vote for you or people who vote, but it actually means people who make up your district. Okay, when something is constituent to something else, you can hear the word in there. It constitutes, right? Constitutes the other thing. Okay. So what does it mean to constitute something? That doesn't mean it's constitutions it, right? Like the Constitution makes up our country. Uh, to constitute something means to create or to make something up. All right. So um, to be constituent is to create something by being a part of it. Okay. So um, the constituent elements of an atom are subatomic particles, right? Protons and neutrons and electrons. Our constituent elements of a cell are our organelles, right? Our mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, right? And our nucleus and things like that. Okay. Uh, the constituent elements or the constituent elements of a um, district in politics are the people who live there, right? So that's why that word constituents exists. Okay, so it's something that makes up something else, right? So that's exactly the circumstance we see here, right? Elements which together form broader reality, right? The things which come together to form something above it. That's what we have in, you know, organelles creating a cell. Here we have 5 experiences uh, of humans which create human reality, right? Sensation, perception, mental formations, consciousness, and form, right? Um, so that reality is produced by things which make up something else, right? And we don't say make up in the sense of like, I make you up, right? Like playing make believe or like making something up in your head, imagination, right? We mean the smaller thing actually composes or creates something larger. All right. So, um, if you saw citizen and constituent and you're like, ah, those two things are the same thing, right? A constituent is a citizen who votes for the person. No, a citizen is just someone who's literally a citizen, right? Like makes up a political body. But a constituent can make up anything, right? Uh, People can be constituent of a voting place, or you can be constituent elements of high school. Okay. Conducive, right? Conducive elements which together form broader reality. Conducive means making something easier, basically, right? Making something work. That doesn't quite fit here. That doesn't really fit or explain the situation, right? You might have heard conducive in the sense of like, uh, you know, being on your phone in class is not conducive to learning. It doesn't allow learning to happen, right? So elements conducive elements which together form broader reality would in a certain way be very redundant. Okay. Then consecutive means one after another, right? And this passage doesn't suggest anything where form comes first, then sensation comes, then perception comes, then mental formations come, and then consciousness comes. Um, that could perhaps be true, right? But the passage itself doesn't say that these things are consecutive, right? It only says that they make something up, right? We know that they make something up together because it says together form broader reality, right? Smaller things coming together to form something bigger. Those smaller things constituent are constituents because they constitute the broader thing. So that's how we get to be. All right, so for question five, the word that is correct is one that you may not have heard too often. Okay, so this is going to be easy if you have all the vocabulary, but let's just make sure we know what kind of word we want to have here. Okay, um, so we are given a sort of unexpected situation, right? Parasitism typically weakens the host, right? Typically makes the host worse, right? However, there's some that actually increase its metabolism, allowing it to grow larger and stronger than it would otherwise. Okay, so this word here, increase, is really important. Um, so it increases or benefits or grows certain elements of its development, even as it ultimately leads to the caterpillar's demise, right? So we're looking into something like adds to, makes better, okay? And augments means that, okay? To augment something is to like sort of like improve or grow or make better or larger, increase it, add to it. Okay, these are all ways you can say this. So there's one example I'm not going to use here, but like, um, you know, you can augment your income by getting like a second job or you know, adding money into the stock market, right? That will augment your income, meaning it will like add or grow to it. Okay. Um, you know, uh, it works here pretty perfectly, even if you don't know where it comes from. Okay. So, yeah, that's where augment comes from, to increase. Okay. To cement something is like cement is to make it hardened stone, right? Doesn't make hardened stone these elements of its development. To implement them means to do them at all, right? These elements of the development would be implemented regardless, right? They would happen whether there's a parasite there or not. It's just that the parasite kind of improves it, right? It makes it stronger or faster or something, right? And then finally, ferments is has to do with like fermentation typically, right? So you can ferment something and it grows, right? Um, but you know, or it can like regard like yeah, but as a verb, it really means like, you know, to turn something where the into like alcohol because bacteria are eating the sugars or yeast is eating the sugar present. That's really all it is. Okay. Um, it also works as a verb sometimes, like agitate, right? Like, or I mean, as a noun, excuse me. Like, um, the country was in the throes of a, you know, uh, political ferment. Okay, meaning like everyone's all agitated about politics, but not a noun wouldn't make any sense here. So that's how we get to augments. All right, our final word in context question from the first module. The correct answer, ancillary, is a really good word and one that I've seen on the official SAT. Okay, so this is not just some Hamilton word or some word thrown in here. This is one that I've seen before, just not in a word in context question. And it's remember, vocab isn't only asked on the word in context; it's asked all throughout the test. This showed up in another question type, a reading question type, but it's vocab that you need to know to succeed on the test. Okay. What does ancillary mean? It means it's like additional, uh, supplementary. Okay. So it's sort of uh, on the side, uh, and also sort of like subordinate, but additional. Okay. So it's additional, smaller, and kind of beneath or something else. All right. Um, so Um, you could maybe say like in business or something like that, you have ancillary products or ancillary services, right? When you go and get your hair dyed and your hair cut, they're also gonna style your hair that day too. That's an ancillary service, right? Like you're not paying for your hair to get styled, you're paying for it to get cut and colored, but they're also going to make it look good, right? Um, you come to Hamilton Education for your SAT, you're improving your SAT, but you're also getting ancillary benefits of learning how to read better, learning more vocabulary, becoming a smarter and smarter seeming person, right? Those aren't what you're exactly paying for, but they're services that are additional to that. So ancillary parties mean they're kind of like additional, smaller, subordinate parties to the big ones. That's perfect here, right? Excessive means additional, but in a way where it is too much, right? There's a value judgment here of negative. Okay, is there any value judgment in this passage which says these parties are excessive, right? There's too many of them. No, right? None of this says anything about too many of them. Just says that they are part of these, you know, uh, parliamentary coalitions. Okay, arbitrary. When things are arbitrary means that they have no essential meaning, right? Um, and these aren't arbitrary parties, okay? Doesn't mean that they're not useless or unnecessary or uh, unimpactful parties. Okay, they're not arbitrary, they're not random parties. They are just smaller. And finally, elective parties. Okay, even though these are elective parties, does that is that what they would the fit what they're being described as here? Like, yeah, they are elected. Okay. But does elective make sense with smaller, right? With partnering, with offering these sort of things in exchange for legislative support, right? Where we have minor parties, right? Minor and ancillary being synonyms, direct synonyms. Do any of these things, secondary parties, secondary and ancillary, meaning very similar to things? Did any of those words align with elective? No, but they all align with ancillary. So if you're selecting elective, you're just thinking, well, this is about politics, and that's a word about politics. You're not thinking about the actual fit or the actual context here. So that's how we arrive to A, to end our first module's word and context. All right, moving on to the reading section of our first module, like the full reading questions. We have a structure and purpose question here about this selection of reading here. I'll take it that you have read this, but one thing I really want to clarify is, main purpose needs the whole text, right? So this whole text is essential. It's not just this portion, right? And it's not just the first portion, okay? So clearly we're reading a work of literature, right? When we read literature, it can and it's literature too because Marco Polo describing these towns. Is this a real town? No, right? Kublai Khan is dubious of the veracity of Polo's stories, meaning he doesn't think they're real. Um, when we're reading literature, it can be natural for us to want to take a really expansive or kind of philosophical take on what the passage means, but we need to stick to the text. Okay, so for example, A, this is probably the most interesting answer choice, and it's one that if you could prove in an AP Lit class, is plausible, right? But within the context of the passage that we're actually reading, let's look at a few things, right? The ground below symbolizing those excluded from power. Is there anyone in Bacchus who is living on the ground? No, right? So how can they symbolize those excluded from power? They really can't. Okay. Is there a ruling class that they talk about in Bacchus? No, they just talk about everyone living on these slender stilts. All right. I'm going to skip the correct answer for now and go to C, which I think is another really compelling, interesting distractor that nonetheless doesn't have any support from the passage, okay, or enough support. So this is talking about the main purpose we talked about, right? The main purpose. Here, critique humanity's tendency to destroy nature, suggesting that the inhabitants of Bacchus have withdrawn from the earth to preserve it. Okay, well, you know, uh, they respect it so much they avoid all contact. Could maybe suggest C. And that they love it as it was before they existed, right? I don't know, maybe, right? That's a way of withdrawing to preserve it. But is that the main claim? No, I don't think we can say that because there's another hypothesis right above it, which is the exact opposite of C, right? That they hate the earth, right? And additionally, to say that the main purpose of this passage only comes from these last sentences, these last clauses, means like uh, that this can't be a part of the main purpose, but it definitely is in this case, okay? So you're fixated too much on trying to make a compelling or interesting literary response to this as opposed to just reading it. D um, is if we didn't have these sentences, D could be true, but because there are these hypotheses provided, we can't say D, so our only correct answer would be B. Let's see if there's anything wrong with it, right? So one, yeah, we describe Bacchus in a way that highlights its physical separation from the earth, right? That's really interesting. We talk about the slender stilts. And then we talk about the ambiguity of its inhabitants' motivations, right? So like, why is Bacchus on stilts? Well, we don't quite know, but here are some options. Okay. It's really just poetry for poetry's sake there at the end, right? So that's how we arrive to B. All right, question 8 here is a really good main idea question in that it really shows how the SAT likes to deal with these questions. So if you missed this, this is definitely one to focus on and to reevaluate your strategy to these questions. Okay. First, of course, read the passage. All right. Um, so we see an annual increase of 0.58 to 1.6 species in areas grazed by bison compared to lesser gains in cattle grazed regions. So it looks like when bison graze somewhere, it improves the number of native plant biodiversity and drought resilience things that we see in tall grass prairies. All right. Why does this happen? The way that they graze and their grazing lawns reduce dominant grass cover, allowing diverse native plants to flourish. They had rapid recovery, historically, all this stuff here, right? Then we see this here. The study suggests that reintroducing native megafauna like bison could restore grassland biodiversity and resilience. Okay. The biggest thing to fixate on in our answer choices is what makes a distractor wrong. Okay. We really need to focus on what makes a distractor wrong. So, main idea of the text. A, this seems to be true in the text, right? We have a sentence here. Historically, millions of bison roamed the Great Plains until near extinction, right? And we also can probably naturally infer that with the fact that bison improve biodiversity, that plant biodiversity probably declined. But is this specifically stated in the text? Not enough for it to be a main idea. So that's why we can get rid of A. Okay. This is one of those true but not necessarily relevant distractors. All right. B, here we have a really good answer choice until we see one word. Okay. Bison serve as a compelling case study for the importance of megafauna reintroduction in restoring habitats. Okay, up till there, that's great, right? But why is B wrong? Across various different ecosystems, which is a little bit of a redundant there, but I just wanted to make it clear. All right. Why do we know that's wrong? We're talking about the grasslands. Is it going to be good to reintroduce megafauna to the desert? We don't know, according to this passage. This passage doesn't dictate that whatsoever. Okay. All right. Uh, Now, again, our focus is there anything wrong with an answer choice? Okay, I don't want us looking for like, ooh, which one sounds the best? I want us looking, is there anything wrong? Reintroducing bison has been shown to double native plant biodiversity, and improve drought resilience. Okay, we see that up here, making it a promising strategy for restoring grasslands. We see that here. Nothing wrong with that, right? There's nothing wrong with C. So that's why it's correct. But if you were moving through these answer choices, I wouldn't select that yet until I look at D and I see, okay, bison and cattle grazing are both essential for enhancing plant biodiversity. Okay, essential is a bit confusing here. It doesn't say that they are needed, but they both do help apparently. But here's the part that's clearly wrong. Cattle are more effective due to their unique grazing behaviors. Okay. That one word, if that said bison, D would be correct. But because it says cattle, it's not. So that's how we arrive to C. Really work on identifying and working through distractors when it comes to these main idea questions. Okay, question 9 here is like question 8, a really good main idea question in that it really shows what the SAT is trying to do with these main idea questions. I think the biggest thing that we can work through here are our distractors, right? Looking at the wrong answer choices and seeing what makes an answer choice wrong. So if you're watching this video, it means you took this test. So I'm expecting you have already read this passage, but let's just understand the passage from a rhetorical sense to some degree, right? So here we see an introduction to our idea. Okay. So Nobel disease, you might be thinking of, ooh, like problems of navigating our own genius, right? In Nobel winners. But actually, it's something else, right? What's the commonplace phenomenon? That Nobel Prize winners adopt unscientific or pseudoscientific beliefs after receiving the award. Okay. It's unexpected. We get all this stuff. Now we get our examples. Pauling, who became a really vocal advocate for high dose vitamin C as a way to cure pretty much everything. And Shockley, right, who promoted eugenics and advocated for selective breeding. These are kind of crazy things. Crick, for example, I believe, from Watson and Crick, I think it was him, also kind of had some crazy things that came after winning his Nobel. Now we see another main idea, okay, another thing that can clarify the main idea. Um, uh, the reason behind is debated, but one thing is that the unconventional thinking that led to their groundbreaking discoveries might also make them more susceptible to fringe ideas. And then, a little caveat here, right? Not everyone does this. So I'm going to look at our wrong answer choices first to show what's wrong with them. Okay. So, correct, right? Um, that part is, maybe true, but many is, perhaps a little strong, but leading to a decline in the reputations within the scientific community. Uh, No, that's probably a natural expectation from this, right? But do we talk about that in the passage? No. Okay. Even if you might expect Pauling and Shockley or others maybe lost some of their reputation, or maybe you're a kid who's into these sort of people and you learned about this and you saw that they, became pariahs or something like that. We can't use that in here. We can only use the text. And what does the text say? Well, the text is examining the idea and the cause of it with some examples given, right? So this part here is unsupported. Okay. Uh, Mental health challenges. I mean, you might say that these are mental health challenges, I suppose, but that doesn't really make sense here, right? That's not what this is about, nor do we see any of the discussion of like the maybe why. All right. Then we have D, a totally wrong distractor, right? They often become experts in multiple fields, which sometimes lead them to adopt controversial beliefs. This experts in multiple fields part is just not supported in the passage at all. So there's something wrong with B, C, and D. Okay, now let's look at A. Let's see if there's anything wrong with it, right? Noble disease is described, okay? And we are given a sort of possible explanation, right? Which is down here of overestimating their expertise or unconventional thinking. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with A. There's something wrong with all the others. Uh, you might be thinking, well, why doesn't it mention our examples or something like that? Well, examples support the main idea. They're not the main idea itself. Okay, so that's how we arrive to A for question 9. All right, now we work on question 10 here. It's a interesting, really good question. Okay, so we have a kind of inference from the details. We infer by the details here. So based on the definitions in the passage, what can be inferred about the ecological characteristics of cathedral pines? All right. So when we look at the passage, we see all this information about what old growth forests are. Okay, so they support diverse plant and animal life, multi-layered canopies and rich soils, right? Um, they're vast old growth with these kind of trees. However, in the 19th and 20th centuries, almost all of these old growth forests were cut, right? However, Cathedral Pines, a 40-acre old growth forest, was preserved and spared from initial logging. So seeing as that it wasn't logged, we know that this meets the definition of old growth, right? Um, so basically it's just asking us if Cathedral Pines is an old growth forest, what kind of, ecology will we see there, right? So we'll see these things. So which answer choice shows those things? B, right? Complex ecosystems, right? Diverse plant and animal life. That's a complex ecosystem. Uh, it's all there. Okay. A describes second growth forests, right? C is kind of a baggage random distractor. Uh, and then again, D is a distractor where we're kind of confusing second growth and old growth forests. All right. So really reading this passage and making sense of it will help you out on a question like that. All right, question 11, we have a command of evidence question. It's our first command of evidence question on this test. That means we are going to connect some element of our text with some element of a kind of like study future sort of thing, okay? So which of the following findings, if true, would most directly support the study's conclusion that Native American fishing villages persisted despite environmental change? All right. So we are looking to support the study's conclusion that these things persisted. So um, that's their conclusion. We see that up here. Okay, so we want to say, okay, what shows an example of this? All right, so um, analysis of sediment layers in the region shows that oyster reefs remained a reliable food source even during periods of significant sea level fluctuations, right? So basically, why does this work? We see that large refuse piles consisting of shells and other food waste, right? are in the sediments, right? And that these early villages uh, rose and lowered based off of sea level that impacted their oyster fishing. Okay, so oysters produce shells, all right? So clearly these two things are connected, but so the thriving of these villages and the size of their seashell middens are intimately connected. But even during these big changes, right, we can see that um, if they're consistently eating oysters this whole time, then that means that they're not going away even when sea levels go low or high. Um, so B is an opposite distractor, right? So we want to see that they persisted. This shows that they go away. Um, C does the same issue. Okay. Finally, D, we have everything might be good here up until it says practice, right? Because other earlier European archaeological sites doesn't make sense here, right? How are we connecting Native American fishing villages with early European archaeological sites? That doesn't make any sense. So the only answer choice with nothing wrong with it would be answer choice A. All right, question 12, we have a command of evidence question using figures, okay? So this is quantitative, meaning we have to look at this figure and make sense of what's going on. So we are looking to combine data from the figure with information from the text to make a new claim, right? So what's the information in the text? We have to know that first, right? So the general scientific consensus has long been that peaches were spread across America directly by European in contact. Uh, However, European trade and colonization in the Southeast, right, that's where we are in the figure, were incredibly limited in the years prior to the 18th century. Okay, so before 1700, remember 18th century is 1700, there was very little European contact. Now, when we look at the settlements here, right, the spread of peaches, we see a super big increase in the scope and scale of peach cultivation among indigenous sites all before there was significant European contact uh, or significant European influence in Southeast America. Okay, so it wouldn't make sense to say that the Europeans are spreading peaches directly, like the scientific consensus was, if there was a bunch of spread before 1700. Okay, so let's see what's wrong in some of our answer choices. Uh, so um, we know that these are not growing natively, and that European settlers, we're not contradicting the idea that European settlers introduced the fruit, right? Uh, you know, Peaches were introduced in the very early 16th century. We see here the very early 16th century is the first time we see any sort of peaches, and it's only two. Okay, so they weren't growing natively. The text and the everything directly contradicts that. All right. Um, so how do we see what's wrong with B? So everything up until this point is true. However, is there anything that supports this in the text? Large-scale European farming operations covered the region by the late 17th century. No, we know that's directly contradicted by this right here. Okay, so we can get rid of B. Now, C, there's nothing wrong with it, right? We already described the logic here, but basically what we're saying is that this is all before the 18th century. And because this took place before the 18th century, we can say that indigenous groups themselves played a major role in spreading the fruit rather than relying solely on direct European contact, right? If they didn't have direct European contact, but were spreading the fruit, it means they were doing it on their own. Finally, if you don't know what the 18th century means, right? After 1600, the rapid spread suggests that the direct contact with Europeans was the primary driver of indigenous adoption of the fruit. That's true for this right here. That's what the scientific consensus was, but Does that make sense within here and with this claim here? No. All right. So it is contradicted in the text and the figure. So a good, relatively straightforward, but still creative kind of command of evidence question here to work through. All right, so we are looking at another command of evidence question here. We want to support the study's conclusions about differences between short and long-term adaptability in bacteria. Okay, so so what is the study's conclusion about short and long-term adaptability in bacteria? Well, we really see it most clearly stated right here. While bacteria can adapt to short-term seasonal changes, so good at short-term, prolonged or extreme environmental conditions, so prolonged is long-term, may lead to lasting evolutionary adaptations. All right, so the bacteria change in the long term, but then they handle it just in minor adaptations in the short term. All right, so we have to, know, again, this isn't a vocab question, but you have to know that prolonged means long term. Okay, so what would support this? So the correct answer shows that pretty clearly, right? So we're looking for short-term seasonal changes lead to small adaptations, and we see that here, right? Seasonal adaptations are largely reversible, but then evolutionary adaptations take place in the long term, right? So long droughts correlate with permanent genetic changes in, some sort of gene. So that's very, very solid. B, okay. Let's see if this supports what we know to be what we're looking for. They do not return to similar states after seasonal changes, instead showing constant genetic divergence. That would mean there's no difference between short and long term, and we're looking for that difference. So that difference B doesn't work. Okay, now C does a good job of explaining the short term, but do we see anything about long term in answer choice C? No. So seeing as that there's no long term, we can't show the difference between short and long term. We're just describing the short term. So you need to describe both sides to make a comparison. And then finally with D, so sort of just not, D might be talking a little bit about things that we see up in here, but it doesn't really have anything to do with short or long term. It's talking about pollution levels and things like that. It doesn't really deal with the actual study's conclusions. So that's how we end up with answer choice A for question 13. I think a pretty straightforward command of evidence question. All right, so question 14 is a command of evidence question. It's one of our trickier command of evidence questions that we see the College Board ask because it is asking us to challenge something identified in the study, right? So we want to challenge the effectiveness of the parenting behaviors identified in her study. So what does she identify in her study as good things, right? So parents who prioritize emotional intelligence often model self-awareness, acknowledge their own mistakes, and allow their children to experience boredom as a way to foster creativity and emotional regulation, right? So allowing those things to take place are effective, all right? They also avoid forcing politeness and other things, okay? They encourage independent decision making, allowing children to develop autonomy and critical thinking skills, okay? So anything that like goes against encouraging independent decision making, prioritizing emotional intelligence, allowing mistakes, allowing boredom, things like that, right? So anything that would show that that isn't actually effective. So A is correct here. Let's explain why. All right. So uh, allowing their children to experience boredom is one of the things that was a identified behavior. But what was the positive outcome according to the study? Creativity and emotional regulation. However, if we see that those who experience boredom have bad self-regulation and engage in impulsive behavior as opposed to being regulated, right? We have an issue in terms of undermining her study. Okay. Uh, B would support her study. So if you chose B, you probably just didn't read the question well enough, right? B would support her study. Yeah, look how much better you are if you're given independent decisions. Um, uh, with C, children who are regularly exposed to emotionally self-aware parents, blah, blah, blah. Um, this again is supporting her challenge or study rather than challenging it. Now with D, D is a really tricky one to get rid of. So politeness norms are less effectively enforced when parents directly instruct children to say please and thank you rather than relying on modeling alone, is actually going to support her claim. Okay, so you have to understand what this is saying. This is saying when parents actually force their kids to say please and thank you, which is the opposite of what she suggests, it's worse than doing what she suggests, which is to just let their kids uh, find out courteousness on their own. Okay, so B, C, and D all support her in different ways. A is the only thing that challenges. If you're missing this, you're probably having a bit of an issue with actually examining like maybe the question itself or making sense of what the answer choice is exactly saying. All right, question 15 is a bit of a bruiser here. This is a hard one. Based on the information in the table and the claims made in the text, can we infer about the relationship between health expenditure and life expectancy? Okay, so uh, in our table, we see something most of us probably know, which is that United States is really high in health expenditure per capita, right? So over $12,000 per person per year. And these other countries have much lower healthcare expenditure, right? Canada being 5,000, Japan being 4,000. However, despite those much lower healthcare expenditures, the United States has a much lower life expectancy than these places, right? So US spends a lot more per capita with a lot lower life expectancy, vice versa. Now we also see over here a healthcare system, right, which shows that all of these other countries have some form of universal healthcare system, meaning everyone gets it. And then we also see what kind of ownership there is, right? So public and private ownership, primarily public, public and private ownership, primarily private, public and private ownership, primarily public, full public ownership, and nearly fully public, as opposed to nearly fully private, like we see in the United States. Okay, so basically we're seeing, all right, and differences between the countries that have lower expenditures with higher life expectancies. I mean, you see Switzerland has a little bit of a higher expenditure than other places, as it has a primarily private uh, healthcare system, but they still have a higher life expectancy, you'll see, uh, or relatively high one. But, the United States kind of defeats that. Okay. So then we read the text and we see the text doesn't directly talk about healthcare whatsoever. It talks about a different idea. Okay. Rent-seeking middlemen. Right. So what are rent-seeking middlemen according to this passage? They are intermediaries, right? People in the middle, middlemen in a market who extract profit without adding real value, often increasing costs for consumers and producers alike. Okay. So uh, costs really high, life expectancy not going up. That's increasing costs without adding real value. They drive up prices by imposing unnecessary fees, controlling access to goods or services, or leveraging regulatory loopholes to their advantage. We see this in ticketing companies. All right. Then we see something that connects here as well. Okay. One way industries can reduce these costs is through increasing public as opposed to private ownership, which limits profit-driven intermediaries. Okay, so by increasing public ownership, that doesn't necessarily mean full public, it means increasing public ownership, you reduce rent-seeking middlemen. We see rail companies, rail systems in countries like France and Japan removed private ticket reselling and led a government-run system. Now they have lower fares, greater efficiency, and more reliable service compared to privately operated rail networks in other countries. All right. So what we're seeing here is, here's the connection. The United States has rent-seeking middlemen, right? And these other countries have eliminated rent-seeking middlemen by increasing public ownership of the industry. All right. So we see that it would lead to, in other industries, lower fares, greater efficiency, and more reliable service. Seems like that is what's explaining these things. Okay. So what do our answer choices say? A, Switzerland's high health expenditure and high life expectancy suggests that rent-seeking middlemen are necessary in any healthcare systems, okay, any, to improve outcomes, even if costs are correspondingly increased. All right. So what refutes A? Well, one, looking at the United States and seeing the word any. A is a too extreme distractor, right? Most times we see these universal or absolute language, like any health system. While that might be true for Switzerland, right? Its life expectancy is a little higher than Germany, Canada, or France, with a little bit of private ownership, a little more private ownership. We can't say that this extrapolation, right, this conclusion is true for all because it's not true for the USA. All right. B, we have this part being true. They have universal healthcare systems with significantly lower costs than the USA. Good. But then, demonstrating that rent-seeking middlemen are not the primary factor driving differences between expenditures, what on earth could point that out based off of that information? Okay. So half of it works, half of it doesn't work. Okay. C, the USA's high health expenditure suggests a greater presence of rent-seeking middlemen in its healthcare system leads to inflated costs. Ooh, okay, good. That's very true. All right. But then, though the impact of these middlemen has no apparent bearing on health outcomes like life expectancy, now this is where the point gets muddied. If that were true, this number would need to be the same as all these numbers, right? Costs could be higher, but life expectancy would need to be the same. However, it seems like when we compare the text with the graph, that rent-seeking middlemen not only increase price, but they also make you die younger. And then finally, our correct answer choice. Japan has low health expenditure and high life expectancy, showing that minimizing rent-seeking middlemen, right, as we see here, allows for more efficient healthcare spending, greater efficiency, and potentially positive relationship with health outcomes like life expectancy. Now notice it says potentially positive, right? That's a good thing to see in an answer choice on the SAT. It doesn't say unilaterally positive or absolutely positive, right? They're staying away from creating a too extreme distractor, like A made. All right, so really pay attention to those kind of words, right? Potentially positive is a lot safer of an answer choice than an extremely positive relationship, okay? So distractors are the name of the game on a lot of these command of evidence questions. You had to do a little bit of logical reasoning on this one, a little bit of critical thinking, and then it's really easy. So hopefully you were able to connect all that to get this one correct by choosing D. All right, question 16 is an inference question. Okay, so we're looking to finish this text based off of what comes before. It's talking about incorporating AI. There are disparities in AI adoption. So basically, the best papers use AI methodologies in their paper, but some research groups use AI far less. What causes this? Uh, Limited access to AI tools and training. Okay. What is it not? I'm going to underline it in red because we don't want this. Rather than a lack of instant interest or resistance to using AI, right? So it's not that they don't want to use AI. It's not that they're against AI. It's that they just don't have access to the tools or training. All right. So which answer choice shows that, basically continues this thought? The thought is basically going to be, this suggests that the more we limit access to AI tools, or the more that we increase access to AI tools, the more likely we'll see adoption increase, and the more likely we'll see better papers, right? So A says that, right? Increasing exposure to AI tools, right? The opposite of limiting access would likely, right? So that's safe, result in broader adoption of AI-driven research methods. Perfect. Exactly what we want. Okay, so B is an opposite distractor because it aligns with what is said to not be there, right? So if you're reading this too quickly and you see, lack of interest or resistance to using AI, that's why they don't use it, you'll select this one because fundamentally distrust is good. But that is an opposite distractor, right? That's not what's driving the disparity. C, okay. This isn't logically coherent with what's coming directly before it. Okay, also we have a too extreme distractor with always outperformed traditional research methods. And then finally, D is sort of like a plausible but unrelated distractor, right? Even if D were plausible or were true, would it have any relation to these last sort of sentences saying that there are disparities that are driven by limited access? No, it has no relationship to that whatsoever. Okay, so A is the only one which continues the logic of this passage. The other ones either repudiate or invalidate the logic of the passage, or they are kind of irrelevant to the logic of the passage. So that's how we arrive to A. All right, so 17, we see inference question. So basically, what we're seeing here is that caffeine um, can cause delays in sleep and reduce sleep duration. However, people who consume caffeine all the time have a reduced sensitivity to its stimulating effects, and some reporting minimal disruption to their bedtime even after consuming caffeine in the evening. All right, so your friend who like drinks coffee all the time, and is always, drinking a yerba mate or something like that, they might be able to just fall asleep after drinking coffee at dinner, whereas someone else who doesn't have coffee ever might have some coffee at like, midday and still have a difficulty falling asleep later that night. All right. So what clarifies all this? So A is correct. There's nothing wrong with the A, right? Habitual, that means daily or more frequent, right? Again, not a vocab question, but we need to know some vocab. Caffeine consumption, so common or frequent caffeine consumption may lead to physiological adaptations that lessen its disruptive impact on sleep, right? I love this here, may lead, right? And we have some here. This is what the SAT does to show safeness in an answer choice, right? It doesn't say will lead to physical adaptations. It doesn't say all report minimal disruption, okay? Whereas B shows the opposite, right? This is a too extreme distractor with sleep quality is reduced for all individuals, regardless of habits or tolerance levels, right? By having all here, that is a too extreme distractor. Might also be a baggage distractor if this is something your parents are always like, doesn't matter how much you're with caffeine, no caffeine before 2 p.m. or after 2 p.m. All right. C is kind of a funny too extreme distractor, right? People who experience significant sleep disturbances from caffeine, they should increase their intake to build tolerance, okay? Um, that's not necessarily illogical, but it's not logical either. Why? Because only some are reporting minimal disruption to their bedtime even after consuming caffeine in the evening. Okay. Those also people who experience significant sleep disturbances from caffeine. It isn't saying that these people are less uh, common users, right? This isn't uh, people who we don't know whether these people who experience sleep disturbances are those who are high caffeine users or low caffeine users. It isn't clarified in this answer choice, okay? So C is kind of a wacky, too extreme distractor, rolling from, something that's like somewhat logical, but on a very tenuous basis. Um, Finally, D saying sleep effects are purely psychological with no measurable physiological differences. Again, this is a too extreme distractor and it doesn't really work from the passage. So that's how we arrived at A. You chose C, you're being a little bit too rambunctious. You really got to read all the words in an answer choice. It doesn't say people less, people who drink less coffee should drink more. It's people, any people. Kind of ridiculous. Okay, so question 18 here on module 1 is our first writing question of the test. We have a verb tense subject agreement question. All right, so we have to figure out the tense of what verb goes in here. So if you're having trouble with these tense questions, I suggest you reference our tense sheet. It's been provided for you in any of our classes at some point. And if it hasn't been provided for you in a class, make sure to ask your tutor or however you're, studying here at Hamilton Education. Our tense sheet is really important because it'll show the difference between every single one of these kind of similar but, different tenses. Okay, so let's talk about what the correct answer choice is here. Has embraced. Okay. This is what we call our present perfect tense. It means it's something that began in the past, but is continuing to this day. Okay. So I want to show why an answer choice like D is incorrect. Is embracing is something that's going on currently, right? You could have just said embraces, right? Is embracing means that it's going on right now with no necessary referent to the past in any degree. However, has embraced, right, shows that he began it in some point in the past. So he, rather than returning to his earlier sound, okay, he has embraced this new approach, okay? So that means since 1997, that's like 25 years ago or more, okay? So this is something that began in the past, but continues to this day, all right? So in doing so, we have that. Had embraced means that it began in the past, but ended. Okay? It began at some point in the past, but ended before something else. I had been interested in going to New York City, but then I found out how expensive hotels were. Okay? I was at one point interested, but I'm no longer interested. Okay? Finally, was embracing is similar to had embraced. It means at one point it was an embrace, but is no longer. So really study your tense table and the meaning of all those tenses if you're struggling with a question like 18. All right. So question 19 is a verb tense question. We really need to figure out what our subject is and what what timing we're in. Okay. So our subject is a planet that meets the criteria. Okay. So not a planet that sustains it, right? It's the criteria here. Um, so just when you plug these in, you'll see how many of them don't work, okay? Liquid water include an atmosphere. Okay, clearly include doesn't work because uh, uh, criteria and planet is singular and include goes for something plural, right? Included doesn't make sense because that's in the past tense. And is this in the past tense? No, it's in kind of this always tense, right? And then finally, including an atmosphere dense enough. If you're just saying, including an atmosphere dense enough, blah, 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 it might sound fine without the context, but when you fit it in the context, you see that the gerund doesn't fit. What we have here is must include. So because we can't use plural, we can't use past tense, we can't use gerund, we must resolve to C. All right, question 20 is not a difficult question. However, it's a really easy question to be wrong on, to make a mistake with. Why? Well, if you're reading it too quickly and you don't read the whole thing, you are going to choose B. Okay? But B is wrong. Why? Well, when you read it on its own, it sounds fine. They have streamlined the process of obtaining prescriptions by offering online ordering, automatic refills, and home delivery by eliminating the need for in-person visits. Okay. Oh, great. There we go. But that's not where a period is. Okay. That's not a period. That's not a period. Here is our period, right? From here to here is its own clause, and from here to here is its own clause. Because we have two independent clauses, we must separate them with either a semicolon, a comma and a fanboys, or a period, okay? Just having by there is wrong. Now, it sounds right when you're flying through this, but if you missed this question, you're making a huge mistake in your approach to the SAT because you are not reading the full text, right? That is how you miss the tricky grammar questions, which aren't that hard officially, but are very tricky and easy to miss, okay? C, we would need a comma. Without the comma, it's a run-on. And A, we don't have a fanboys, so this is a comma splice. Our only correct answer is going to be D, which uses one of our proper punctuation marks to separate the two independent clauses. Everyone should know that if they were to have read the whole thing. But by selecting B most likely, or any of these other ones, you're running into some of the issues of not reading the whole thing or not knowing the rules of connecting independent clauses. All right, if you missed question 21, you got a hard question wrong, even though it's actually an easy question as well. Why do I consider this question to be hard? Well, I think it's really easy to make a mistake on, to not understand the meaning and not look for the clues that guide us to the correct answer. But why is this easy? Well, because the meaning of the passage is so clear once you read it that every single other answer choice doesn't work. Okay, so we have two clauses here. All right, our correct answer is A. Let's show you why. We have a clause beginning with the Green Bay Packers and another clause ending with nonetheless. Why does that make sense? Okay, well, for one, we wouldn't want to have, like we've seen answer choices C or D, nonetheless as a transition in the second clause. Why? Because we already have a transition in the second clause, okay? The Green Bay Packers, on the other hand, to say nonetheless, the Green Bay Packers, on the other hand, is totally illogical because you have two competing transitions standing in the way of one another, nullifying one another almost, okay? We already have a transition. So nonetheless, doesn't make any sense to put in that second sentence because it is not concise, nor is it precise, right? We're making an error of having those two transitions. However, if you chose either of those, it's probably because you're really familiar and really comfortable with the idea of a transition coming at the beginning of a clause. But remember, that's not the only place transitions can come. They can come at the beginning of a clause, the end of a clause, or in the middle of a clause, just so long as they are in the right clause. Okay, so they have to be in the clause that logically they must be in, but where they come in that clause doesn't impact the logic of the sentence, right? If it's at the beginning, the middle, or the end, the logic stays the same so long as it is in the logically correct clause. So why does nonetheless need to be in the first clause, right? They'd poured millions into stadiums and other appeasements in attempt to prevent these betrayals, which happened nonetheless. All right. So the nonetheless is functioning to say which happened anyways. It's working like the word anyway. All right. It could have come before the happened, which nonetheless happened, or after, which happened nonetheless. Either one works. Okay. The reason why we can't do B though is because B doesn't give any sort of distinction between the two independent clauses, right? After the word the is an independent clause, and before the word nonetheless is an independent clause. To connect those two independent clauses, we need either a semicolon, a comma with a fanboys, or a period. B gives us none of those options. All right. So A is working because there's something wrong with B, C, and D, and nothing wrong with A. If you missed this, really think about how things actually work rather than just how they typically appear. The SAT loves to test questions which seem like they align with what we commonly know or commonly do, but actually differ. All right, if you're missing 22, you are missing a question that is easy to get correct, but also very easy to get incorrect. It's one of those ones where if you look back on it and you see that you missed this, after a minute of reading, you might go, oh my God, I'm so dumb, right? Why did you probably miss this question? Probably because you didn't read the whole context. Okay. That is what the SAT loves to test and loves to do to get smart students who are moving too quickly and who are too overconfident to make an error. All right. So, what is the example of that in this sentence or in this passage? Okay. Um, it reads naturally to say legal codes from the 1500s continue to protect the right of peasants to gather food seen as a necessity in times of hardship, right? That sounds really natural. But a comma is not a period. A comma is not a semicolon. A comma is a comma. All right. A comma can only be used in lists or with a fanboys to connect independent clauses, but this doesn't have a fanboys, so it must be connecting a dependent and independent clause. When you read the rest of it, you see, now here's the independent clause. Gleaning became the subject of Agnes Varda's 2000 documentary, The Gleaners and I. Amazing movie, by the way, which explores contemporary gleaners who salvage discarded foods and goods. All right. Now you see, seen as a necessity in times of economic hardship is a dependent clause beginning this sentence. You can't just combine it with the things preceding it. Okay. Uh, B is a run-on. C is a run-on. And A is a comma splice and a run-on. All right. We need a period or a semicolon there to signify that we have a whole new unit, a whole new like complex sentence coming after the word food, beginning with the word seen. If you're moving too quickly and not reading the whole thing, you're gonna miss this. But that's a really unfortunate way to miss a question that you could probably get right with just a little bit of extra effort. All right, 23 is a transitions question. Really interesting information in this, but the biggest thing here is to think about our logical relationship towards things. Okay. What a transition does is it clarifies the logical relationship between two units of information, right? The same way an addition sign or a plus clarifies that you are adding two things together, or a subtraction sign, a minus, signifies that you are subtracting two things, one thing from another, I mean. Transitions do the exact same thing. So if you're missing that, you're not understanding that, when you start with 6 and you end with 3, you're subtracting. You're missing something very simple here, right? Which is the logical relationship that we're looking to convey. The goal is not to take answer choices and plug them in, but figure out the logical relationship. So what is the logical relationship here? We are exemplifying in the sentence here the claim made in the previous sentence. All right. So the claim made in the previous sentence is that the policy perspective of antitrust activity has gone away. All right. Unfortunately, according to this passage. All right. So we then exemplify that. When you read the sentence, it says, look, they're more lenient towards consolidation, allowing tech giants, media conglomerates, and pharmaceutical firms to dominate entire industries with little intervention. All right. So that exemplifies this up here. It's an example, right? It isn't an outcome. It isn't an effect, right? It isn't like repudiation. Okay. It's an example. So, nevertheless and yet both don't work. They both fail to demonstrate the logical relationship. Why? Nevertheless and yet both are pivots, right? They contradict or repudiate what comes before. Many people think it's good to wash your hair every day, yet science shows that washing your hair every 2 or 3 days is much better from a health perspective for your scalp. All right. Uh, that relationship isn't here. Okay. It affirms what comes before. I want to show why therefore is wrong. Okay. Uh, Therefore would mean that this is the cause and this is the outcome. But is the cause that the policy perspective has subsided? No, that is the outcome. The cause and the outcome are the same thing. The policy perspective, this whole deal is gone, right? So that would be like saying, you know, I am tall, therefore I am tall. That doesn't make any sense, right? I am tall, thus I am tall. That would only make sense if the next claim or the next sentence was some effect of being tall. I am tall, therefore I am uncomfortable on planes, right? Increasingly shows that we're exemplifying or giving an example of the claim that precedes it. Okay, so the claim preceding or whatever is that uh, policy period has subsided. How can you tell? Well, you can tell because they're far more lenient to all these things. So increasingly works best for this logical relationship. If you missed 24, I would suggest you watch the video to 23 to really think about the overview for transitions questions. But for this one, I'm just going to go through why each of these do not work, okay? What is the relationship logically between these units of information? It is that this final sentence clarifies or sums up the claims of the preceding information. The preceding information says there's a really deep debate, and this deep debate is more than just tactical. It's about how the game works. Okay? Consequently doesn't work because consequently would mean that this part is a direct effect, a direct consequence of what came before, right? But the debate being not about tactics, but about philosophy, isn't a consequence of the fact that there are different tactics and philosophies, right? That's a summary of it. By contrast, would mean that we're pivoting away and we're not doing that whatsoever. We're continuing and really just summarizing the previous thoughts. And then similarly would mean that we are giving a new but similar example to exemplify an earlier claim, right? Most teachers are smart. For example, David Lord is very smart. Similarly, Rio is very smart, right? If we had that, we could use similarly, but this isn't another example of a preceding thing. It is a summary. So at its heart is the least SAT sounding of these transitions, but that doesn't mean it's the weakest transition, right? It is the one which clarifies the relationship, the logical relationship, and that's always going to be the correct answer, whichever one is most logical. All right, 25 is a transitions question. If you're missing this question, I really recommend you watch the video for question 23, where I talk a little bit about transitions questions as a whole and how we approach these questions. But just to reiterate, we always want to think about the logical relationship between the preceding and the proceeding, meaning the bits of information, meaning the information that comes before the transition and the information that comes after it. We want to make sure that our transition shows the logical relationship between those two bits of information. All right. So what are these bits of information? Okay. Here, I mean, we're talking about this really brilliant idea of California being its own nation. We'd have the best flag in the world. We wouldn't have to deal with the rest of the country. I would die for California. Okay. So we should definitely do this. That's not me being sarcastic whatsoever. Nonetheless, we get all these good examples of why it's a good idea or why it would be successful to secede from America and create a beautiful, successful nation in California. And then we see, on the other hand, that there are risks. Okay, so we are pivoting between these two uh, things. Okay, we're going to have to offer a concession here. We need to concede that even though it's a really great idea for us to secede, there are going to be some issues that will make it difficult. All right. So that's the logical relationship between these two. Many of these don't show that, right? As a result, for example, is when we can get rid of. As a result, secession carries immense risks, right? That would mean that all of these things are bad reasons for why we would want to secede, but they're not. They're showing how it would be a good idea for Californians to do it, right? In fact, would mean that we're emphasizing what comes before. okay? But we're not talking about risks beforehand. We are talking about the opposite of risks. In other words would mean we would be restating what came before. If we used in other words what comes later would need to be, rephrasings of why it's such a good idea to secede. However, we get a concession, right? We get the reasons why it's not necessarily going to be very practical to secede. So, to be sure doesn't mean that it's not your parents saying to be sure, right? Like saying be sure about something. It's a way of showing a concession in the same way you might say, nonetheless, nevertheless, or something like that. It doesn't sound like a quote unquote SAT type transition, but it works perfectly here, and it's the only one that doesn't create an illogical error. All right, 26 is a rhetorical synthesis question. With these questions, I recommend you read this question stem first and then look at the notes. One thing to always watch out for are answer choices which use information from the text but don't answer the question correctly, or questions which answer choices which answer the question correctly, like they're really logical at answering the question, but they don't use information correctly from the text. All right. So, for example, A, they both do have continuously growing incisors, and they do have similar diets. However, are they classified together? No. Okay. So that's why we can get rid of A. B, though they're taxonomically different, they share an order due to their superficial similarities. So do they have superficial similarities? Yes. Are they taxonomically different? Yes. Do they share an order? No. How do we know that? Well, right here, it says they're separate orders. C, they are different from rodents despite striking similarities in terms of identical incisor growth, locomotive diversity, and diet. All right, so this one is wrong because do they have striking similarities in terms of locomotive diversity? No, right? This is one of the things that's different between them, right? Do they have similar diets? No, they have different diets, right? Do they have identical incisor growth? No, right? So as such, they're different from one another. They don't have striking similarities in those ways. They have superficial similarities in other ways. Finally, D, nothing wrong with it, right? They are a distinct order, differing in dental structure, diet, and evolutionary lineage. So just make sure you're following those steps when you do a rhetorical synthesis question. All right, the final question on Module 1, we have a rhetorical synthesis question. We really want to make sure that we are not running into issues in terms of like an answer choice answering the question, but not using correct information from the notes, or an answer choice using correct information from the notes, but not answering the question. Okay, so we need to highlight the literary contributions and distinctive style. All right, so this part's true, okay, but is any part of it wrong according to the notes? Did she implicitly critique the government and social policies of her country? According to these notes, we don't see that at all. So A is wrong because it isn't supported by the notes. Okay, B is correct because these are supported in the notes all the way through, right? So we see that here, here, we see it in a bunch of places, okay? C, right? She was born in Ukraine, good. And she did have a Jewish background, good. But is she known for her explorations of her Jewish background? No, right? Nowhere in here does it say that she is interested in exploring or that her novels explore her Jewish background. Okay, so it's unsupported. Finally, D, her career is defined as much by her literary work as by her public persona. Okay, her public persona did matter. And famous interviews explaining her work's hidden meanings. Well, when we look here, that these two refute one another, so we can get rid of D. So if you're missing a rhetorical synthesis question, you might just need to spend a little more time on it. Make sure you give it enough time when you're running through the test. And make sure you're really checking off, does it answer the question? Does it use correct information from the notes? If it fails to do either of those things, then the answer choice probably doesn't work. Okay, question one here on the second module. We need to make sure we're really finding the spot that defines our word. Okay, so sometimes that will be right next to our word. That's what we see on the more medium or easier questions, right? And our definition is right here, allowing it to reorganize itself in response to experience. Okay, we're talking about the brain here. Plasticity is something that we use pretty often to discuss the brain. Okay. There's actually all these commercials you may have seen at some point in your life, either as like a ad while scrolling or on the real TV or something, talking about neuroplasticity, which is what is plasticity? It's the ability to reorganize itself, easily mold itself, moldability. Plastics are called plastics because they're easy to mold, right? Um, Intractability means it's really like hard to deal with and deeply rooted. Okay, if you're being intractable, um, it means like you're just kind of being incredibly stubborn, like really stubborn. Uh, Intractable problems in college admissions are the fact that every college wants to increase the number of people that they are rejecting every year. That's a really hard problem to solve, and it's really deeply rooted. Luminosity, put there kind of ironically, because I feel like they're a company that works on neuroplasticity. Luminosity means it's like brilliance. Okay, lumen, that a lumen is like the unit of how much brightness there is when we're talking in physics. Luminosity means how bright something shines. Okay, so can the brain have a lot of luminescence? Can the brain have luminosity? Kind of, right? You could say that by saying someone's really smart, right? Or like has really brilliant ideas. Um, but does that mean reorganizing itself in response to experience? No, that's plasticity. Okay. Then finally, rigidity is an opposite distractor, right? Rigidity is exactly the opposite of what we want here. We want to say it's moldable, it's flexible. Rigidity is the opposite. Um, but if you think of plastics as rigid and rigidity as rigid, you might got rid of both of those because you thought they meant the same thing. So make sure you're finding the definition and you're making, embedded in the passage and choosing something that fits the actual context of the passage rather than just sounds good next to the words around it. Okay, question two here. It's talking about yerba mate, and hey, check it out, Wonder who wrote this test. So about yerba mate. Okay. It talks about how yerba mate, typically from South America, has managed to spread much further than you would expect it to be. It's not only in South America, now it's very much a part of uh, life in the Middle East and the uh, Levant, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, places like that. There's a lot of yerba mate consumption. Okay. So we see that here, right? Through migration and trade, the drink has managed to basically spread far beyond its original homeland, reshaping daily rituals in entirely new settings. Okay. To originate far beyond its original homeland is kind of an opposite distractor here. That sounds good, but it doesn't work, right? Because where did it originate? In its original homeland. It can't originate in the place far from its original homeland. That doesn't make any sense. Okay. To elaborate is to give more information about something. Elaborate doesn't really fit here at all, right? If you want to elaborate on something, you're giving us more. Okay, now dissipate does mean to spread, kind of, right? But it also means to disappear. It's to spread to the point of disappearing, okay? Um, Water vapor dissipates over time because it spreads further and further and then becomes more and more absorbed until it disappears, right? So which of these means spread in the best sense? To circulate, okay? Spreading, revolving around the world and gets all the way there, okay? Circulate is maybe not the most common way we would say this, but it is a way that certainly works within the context and the meaning, and all the other ones simply don't work. All right, so three is certainly a hard word and context vocab question, but it's also one which we can get correct through eliminating answer choices and through practicing what we call the 90-10 rule, which is where we use roots, prefixes, and suffixes to figure out what a word means and see if that fits. So let's talk about what doesn't work. All right, what are we trying to say here? What's the meaning of this passage? That's going to let us figure out what doesn't work in this context. All right, so they are the first family. And that's actually the definition of the correct word. Okay. Shaping the genre from the very beginning, okay, the very onset, with their harmonies and transfigurations of Appalachian music, right? Her guitar style is the blueprint from which nearly all country guitar styles are derived. But this as is important, okay? While her guitar style might be the blueprint, is she the blueprint? No. She is the first family. She is the first shaper, right? All these other people got their start through the Carter family. So Carter family is amazing. Mother Mabel is amazing. Okay, she's done some amazing things. So, couldn't you say that someone is a scholar of the genre? Absolutely, that fits in terms of how it sounds. But is that the meaning of this passage? Are we saying that she's a scholar of this genre? I don't think so, right? Even if she had to study some traditional music or something like that, um, she wasn't a scholar of country music. This doesn't suggest anything that she was a scholar of country music. It looks like it's trying to say that she's like a founding father of country music, right? Which is a bit funny with the gender thing there, but whatever. Okay. Patron, patron. Okay. That means someone who basically patronizes someone else. Now, that doesn't mean patronize in the negative sense of like, oh, like this feels patronizing, like you're talking down to me. It means you're supporting someone monetarily for their art. Okay. A patron of the arts is someone who buys paintings so like artists are able to keep painting. All right. Or it's like a boss, which same in Spanish, patrons. Father, okay. But father, pach, you know, P-A-T-R, patria from Latin, uh, means first or, you know, leader, but in this case, not in a way that makes sense here. Okay, finally, another one which has the right roots, but not the right meaning is prototype, right? She's one of the truest prototypes of the genre. A prototype is an object, okay? She could have created the prototype of the genre, right? That would maybe make sense. But can a person be a prototype? Simply put, not really. Okay? A prototype is an object. It is the first thing. Proto meaning first or before, and then type meaning thing, object. It's the first object, right? The prototype of anything for any object is the first one made. Okay? Usually it's something of a test. She's not an object, though. So then we've got progenitor. Ooh, okay. This works perfectly, right? What does a progenitor mean? Okay, well, it is a person or something, a person really, from which everything else descends. Okay, in the Bible, Adam and Eve are the progenitors of all of humankind, right? So we're all cousins then. Um, so think of this word, progeny. Okay. Progeny means all of like the family tree, right? You know, people try to figure out their progeny with like ancestry.com or 23andMe or something like that. That means to find out the family tree. They're trying to find the progenitor, the person who is the first. okay, to create a whole family. So that's what progenitor means. So oftentimes it's used in like art specifically. So this is a common way you will see this. All right, four is definitely the question where you just need to know some vocab. You probably need to know what mollify means. I've seen it on the test. It was actually on one of our practice tests from the College Board, mollify. So if you're seeing this and you're on this sort of like grievance trip of, oh God, these Hamilton tests are so much harder and so it doesn't really matter, right? Like, no, this has been on a test, mollify. It's one of the harder words on this test, but it also would be one of the harder words on a College Board test. It's a word that's been used. Okay. So what does mollify mean? Well, to give you another synonym that you probably don't know, it means to placate. Ooh, well, what does placate mean? Well, it means to appease the sort of power or capacity to ruin of someone else, right? Someone's really angry. They're like, I'm gonna beat you up. You can mollify them by saying like, wow, never mind, you're so strong. Like you're making them, okay, yeah, you're right. I'm not gonna beat you up. Okay. So to mollify is usually from a position of lesser power to make or appease someone with more power. Okay. So some of these other words that don't work. Okay. When you mitigate something, means you kind of like get the best like limitation of a bad situation, right? So if it's, you know, if the problems of car use are one of the biggest problems of car use is emissions, right? Contributing to greenhouse gases. Okay, we can mitigate that problem by reducing the emissions of cars. Okay. Now, we didn't solve global warming, but we're mitigating or limiting the problems of one particular example, okay, or one particular aspect. So to mitigate larger powers would mean to like make the larger power limited, right? Which doesn't really make sense here, right? You can maybe mitigate some of the issues of being a smaller power, but you can't mitigate larger powers through concessions, diplomacy, policy alignment. Okay. They're basically trying to, what is this passage saying? This passage is saying that weaker nations need to make stronger nations happy and appease them so that they don't get ruined, right? Especially when those larger nations are in contrast with each other. Okay, we see this a lot in politics and international diplomacy right now. Okay, a lot of people, uh, you know, brown nosing, as they would say. Okay, so mollify, this works perfectly here, right? Small things, weaker things, trying to appease the strength of someone else so they don't get beat up. Okay. To induce something is to cause something about, right? To induce a larger power would be to like ask for help from God or something like that, basically. Okay. That doesn't really make sense here. And then to incite larger powers is an opposite distractor here, right? If you're inciting something, it means like you're causing something to happen, usually in a sort of like violent way, right? Inciting violence is to like get people all agitated and acting up. Okay. So that doesn't work here either. So if you know what mitigate, induce, and incite mean, you should arrive to mollify, even if you don't exactly know what mollify means. But if you've been studying your vocab at all, this one's really pretty easy. It's exactly what the word means. It's always used in this context. This is how you see it in the real world. But if you're not trying to do that, then you might miss this one. All right, five is a good example of a time when we kind of break down what the 90-10 rule and just knowing our words is important. Okay, so what does this all say, right? It says that the tortured artist stereotype suggests creative work must emerge from suffering, right? and is only accessible to those plagued by personal demons, right? Um, then we see some opposites that clarify, right? So misery would fit here, right? Miserable people, right? A profound struggle, right? Um, so we need something that kind of means individuals who are struggling in bad places, sad, emotional, etc. Okay. So what does malignant mean? Malignant is like badly intentioned or badly consequences, right? So remember if we're talking about um, cancer or something like that, it means it's like infectious, it's going around everywhere. Malevolent is another word you could use for malignant. It's basically like just something kind of evil, right? Doesn't make sense here. It's not evil individuals, it's people who are just in a bad place. Maligned means criticized. Okay. And that's in there because you might make a baggage distractor. Oh, Van Gogh, he was much maligned. Nobody liked Van Gogh, right? But it's not just that, right? It's about misery and struggle. So now we're between disconsolate and dispassionate. Dispassionate is a word I've seen actually multiple times on the test. I've seen it a lot. Okay. It's a word that we might think means unhappy because passion can sometimes be related to like feeling or emotion. You might think it means dishappiness, right? Or lack of happiness, but really just means lack of clear emotions, not in a depressed way, but in a simply kind of like logical, objective way. Making a dispassionate decision is to make one where you're just looking at the facts and you're not considering your personal perspectives, right? We're supposed to have a dispassionate judiciary, right? Our judicial crew is supposed to just look at laws on the basis of the laws without having their personal opinions or their political beliefs sway them whatsoever. So dispassionate doesn't figure because it doesn't mean unhappy people. It means uh, people who are like too logical, basically. Disconsolate, now that is perfect. Okay. It means really unhappy. Okay. Uh, so if you console someone, it means you're giving them comfort, right? So to be out of consoling, right? Disconsolate means you can't even be comforted. You're down so bad, right? So down bad that you're not even able to be like happy, uh, completely lacking in cheer. So that's how we arrived to C. All right, six, we have a whole bunch of words that sound like they mean the same thing, but actually don't. Okay. This is like one thing that we'll see on the SAT. Once a test, a bunch of words that are very similar sounding, but all have different meanings, just to throw kids off. Okay, so what kind of word do we want to have here? We want a word that means more pressing, more immediately apparent, more close, right? Closer than ever, okay, is what we're looking for, right? Impertinent doesn't work. To be impertinent is basically to be kind of like rude almost, right? It's like you're acting outside of the bounds of socially accepted behavior. Okay, if you're being impertinent, it's like asking a question, like your teacher comes into school and you're like, so do you have a girlfriend? Right? Or like, do you have a boyfriend? Right? Like asking your teacher those sort of questions is impertinent, right? That's not something that you ask a teacher. It's, kind of like almost rude, but really it's like just like not socially acceptable. Okay, imminent. This is a word that not a lot of people know, right? It's basically like inherent in terms of like really vested in the thing. All right. So, like it's basically like existing within or remaining within, right? Um, So, like, imminent powers are basically powers that exist within a certain thing. So, in like governance, right? The imminent power of one of the imminent powers of the executive or the president is vetoing, right? President can veto things. Might not be imminent to give executive orders. It's not actually something that the president's really allowed to do. Uh, so uh, sometimes it's, used to talk about God or things like that as well. So that's imminent. Imminent, very similar sounding, very similarly spelled, means really close to taking place, right? If there's a volcano's imminent eruption, it means it's gonna happen really soon. This is a common word, imminent, okay? Means it's about to happen, it's ready to happen, right? Uh, if you're having a surprise party and the guest's arrival is imminent, it means you better go hide and stop talking or yapping or whatever, like just get into your hiding spot because they're going to be there soon. It's imminent. Finally, eminent. Okay. That's like His Eminence the King. Okay. Eminent means really important person, VIP. Okay. Top of the top. All right. So the only one that fits the closer that we're looking for here in 6 is imminent. All right. So similar sounding words. It's something that the SAT tests sometimes. We've got it here. Okay, this is probably one of the hardest ones on the test. It's an example of the hardest one you would see on the SAT. With that, we finish the word and context questions. All right, question 7 here is a cross-text connections question. It's our only one on the test. It is a very difficult question because we have some older texts we're reading from, but this is something we've seen the SAT do. We've seen them use older texts like this, people like Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke. So that's why we created a question like this. So we're asked, how would Edmund Burke most likely respond to remarks made by Thomas Paine in text 2? All right. Well, we wouldn't have to guess what Edmund Burke is going to say. We don't have to like read his text and imagine kind of what his thoughts are or how he might respond to Thomas Paine. These are in direct relationship with one another. In fact, Thomas Paine's Rights of Man was published in part in response to Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. And Edmund Burke's Reflections was in part published in response to something Thomas Paine wrote. Okay, so they're in direct relationship. We can find that here. So first, we would need to understand what the remarks are made by Thomas Paine, and then try to understand where Edmund Burke would respond. So I'm assuming you've already read both of these because you're watching this question. So every age and generation must be as free to act for itself as the generation and ages which preceded it. All right. The vanity and presumption of governing beyond the grave is the most ridiculous and insolent of all tyrannies. The circumstances of the world are continually changing, and the opinions of men change also. And as government is for the living and not for the dead, it is the living only that has any right to it. Okay? So this specifically is saying those who are alive in the present moment, in this particular, iteration of whatever is going on, are the only people who have kind of any right to determining their government or what have you. Okay? Anything else is unnatural. It is only the living who have a right, a responsibility. Okay? The first text says basically exactly the opposite, right? It says society is a contract. So they agree here. They're both agree it's a contract. But society should not be thought of as anything like, trading pepper and coffee or calico tobacco or some other low concern, meaning like unimportant concern, to be taken up for temporary interests. Here is the main idea, right? It is to be looked on with reverence, right? It is not a partnership in things subservient only to existence of a temporary or perishable nature, right? It is not perishable nature. It is a partnership in all science, all art, all virtue, all perfection. Then here we see the most important thing, okay? The ends of such a partnership cannot be obtained in many generations. It becomes not only a partnership between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are yet to be born. All right? This here is exactly the opposite of what Thomas Paine says when he says, The living is the only one who has any right to the government in the present moment. Okay. Burke says, no, the dead, the living, those babies and those babies yet to be born all have a right to it. Okay. So how would this guy respond to that claim? He would say this. He already did respond to that claim. He already said it's more than just those who are living. Okay. So what can we get rid of here? We can definitely get rid of with approval, right? And then we can also get with resignation. He doesn't have a resignation to it. He doesn't approve it, right? Resignation means sort of like a sad acceptance. Okay. Now, skepticism, that sounds pretty good, right? But so does disapproval. So we're not going to be able to decide based off of either skepticism or disapproval. We're going to have to look at how these are qualified. So C says, because Payne does not substantiate his claim, but do either of them substantiate their claims? Is that what either of them are really doing here? No. D, because changing conditions are insufficient justification for changing the form of government. Ah, that's exactly here, right? Right? This is exactly what he says here. These sort of things, these temporary concerns, are not the deal with government. Government is something much deeper than that, right? So that's how we arrive to D for this very tricky question 7. All right, question 8 is a text structure and purpose question. It comes from literature. If you're missing a question like this, I think you might be thinking too much about your AP Lit or AP Lang tests and not enough about how we need to respond to passages on the SAT. On the SAT, we infer only what is logically given to us. We don't want to infer too far, okay? So we get this information about Hans Reiter. This is from the best book of all time, by the way, Roberto Bolaños, 2666, all right? We see that, some people say the C is the symbol for the English, but the forest is the symbol for the Germans. And this guy, Hans Reiter, on the other hand, didn't like the sea, nor really the forest, right? What he liked was the seabed. So something totally different, all right? So A is going too far, associating the sea with madness and defeat. Unclear where this comes from, unsupported, right? If you're answering with that one, you're reading too deeply into this literature. Okay. B, we're getting too in the weeds, right? Are we really describing English and national identity, right? Are we really linking these two according to this passage? No, our focus is on Hans Reiter, right? And additionally, this underlined portion doesn't have anything to do with the English or the British. I mean, the English or the German. Rather, it has solely to do with our character of Hans Reiter. C, is our character rejecting stereotypical metaphors and perspectives, right? No, right? Is he seeking to flout societal conventions in this text here? Nowhere is that stated directly, right? What is our answer choice that has nothing wrong with it? D. Okay. It establishes a contrast between how this guy sees the sea, which he looks at as the underneath, the seabed, and that of ordinary people, which in turn suggests something about how Reiter is unique in terms of his nature and his perspective. There's nothing false about that. Nothing about that goes too far. It's a really safe inference. And that's how we resolve to D. All right, question 9, we're talking about phthalates. I'm just dropping that PH. No way I'm going to pronounce that there. Okay. We are looking to base ourselves from the text, use inference or information from the text to infer how phthalates contaminate certain foods. All right, so here they say their phthalates contaminate foods, right? Especially certain various food items. They are not allowed to be directly added. However, they are allowed to be in certain contacts, such as in the production of polymers. What is that? Packaging materials. And these packaging materials come into contact with food products during different stages. So processed foods contain high levels of phthalates, right? So seemingly, they're not allowed to be injected into there directly, but they seem to be coming from certain contact with the packaging materials. Okay, so let's see what's wrong in these and right in the correct one. Are phthalates naturally occurring compounds found in certain food ingredients? Nowhere says that they are naturally occurring, right? They're actually chemicals used to make plastics more flexible. So A is wrong on that basis. B, are they added intentionally to food processing? Well, we are seeing that they are not authorized to be directly added, so B can't be right either. C is wrong for the same reason as B is wrong, right? They cannot be added directly to food. So those are the reasons why A, B, and C are wrong. Why is D correct? Well, it seems logical that if they're not allowed to be directly connected, but they are allowed to be in the packaging, then they're probably getting into the food during packaging and processing. So that's how we arrive to D for this question 9. All right, question 10, we are asked about the main idea. All right, so we want to be able to identify what is our specific main idea from this text, okay? So I'm going to take it that you have read this text, which basically says we interviewed a bunch of skateboarders and how they feel about going through the natural environment, right, of like a city, right? So the main idea is just describing that study. These answer choices are wrong because they don't either explain the whole main idea or they have some part of it that is wrong, right? Um, so is the main idea that the noise they create is often disruptive to the public? Not really, right? It's mentioned as a little bit, but it's not definitely not the main idea. Okay. Um, B, okay, skateboarding is particularly beneficial for individuals with sensory processing differences. Okay, while it does mention that sensory processing, uh, differences is something that, is included in the study, is that really what the main idea is here? No, the main idea is that sound is just a big deal for skateboarders' engagement with their environment. C says basically it only focuses on the skate sound paradox, which is one aspect of this, but the bigger aspect is just that skateboarders care about the sound. It impacts in positive ways their sensory engagement with the environment, right? So that's why C is wrong. Why is D correct? Well, it just says that auditory perception in skateboarding enhances sensory engagement, social connection, and spatial awareness. We see spatial awareness and sensory engagement. Social connection is the only one that we have to do any sort of real inference with, right? By, coming together socially, which we see up here, and also by being aware of how they want to minimize disruption to others. That's where we see the social element. And that's how we arrive to D, yet again, for another reading question, question 10. All right, question 11 is a great command of evidence question, all right? So we are looking to undermine. Remember, undermine is to repudiate, is to contest, is to make bad the researchers' conclusions about early humans tool making. So I'm going to take it that you read this passage, all right? So what do the researchers conclude about early human tool making? They say that sophisticated tool making may have developed in complex rainforest environments contemporaneously or at the same time as in arid African regions. Okay, so their claim is stone tools got just as complicated and were developed at the same time in the rainforests as the place where we typically think that they're coming from, which is arid regions. All right, so we want to undermine that. What does that mean? We want to show that actually they didn't come at the same time. The arid regions came beforehand. Okay, that would undermine it. We need to show arid regions coming beforehand to undermine that claim. So, what does that best? Answer choice D, right? So, the ancient stone tooling techniques, right? So this is the ones that they're looking at up here. These ancient stone tooling techniques are linked to significantly earlier production in an arid region. All right. If that's the case, then that totally undermines their argument. If what the oldest things being done in the rainforest is just kind of a copy of something that was done significantly earlier in arid regions, well, then that undermines the idea that they happened at the same time. Okay. So A doesn't undermine their argument. It just suggests that these things are happening in other rainforest regions. B, we're talking about the wrong thing, right? So stone tooling is what we're looking to talk about, human tool making, right? But this is about ancient cave paintings, so we're talking about the wrong thing. Even though this would undermine something, it doesn't undermine their claim. It undermines something about paintings. And then finally, C, human presence in the Sahel, which is arid, predating human presence in the equatorial rainforests, is irrelevant here ultimately because we don't know if that human presence, which predated the people living in the rainforest, included tool making, right? Maybe people lived in the Sahel, which is arid, for hundreds of thousands of years before they moved in the rainforest. But it was only when they got to the rainforest that they started making stone tools. That isn't omitted. That presupposition isn't omitted by answer choice C. But D clarifies that, right? Which is why D is the best undermining of the researcher's conclusions, right? Whereas the others either don't go far enough or don't go anywhere at all. All right, with 12, we have a command of evidence question where we're connecting a graph and our information, okay? So here's a table which is outlining the price of all these different things, particularly egg price, and then the price of certain inputs, and the price and the number of chickens lost to avian flu. Okay, so then we read the text and we see that, a lot of people are really complaining about egg prices. Economists, though, posit that egg prices are primarily a function. So there's all these horrible explanations of why egg prices are so high, but really it's just a function of two criteria: the cost of inputs required to produce eggs, and the overall quantity of hens laying eggs for sale on the market. So the quantity of hens laying eggs and the cost to feed those hens is what determines the price of eggs. So demand and the market quantity are very constant. Therefore, the final consumer cost is determined by the cost of producing eggs, which is the prices of typical chicken feed. However, the marketplace can radically impact the final consumer cost of eggs, right? So the quantity of egg-laying hens is typically very constant, unless, as we see here, they are lost to avian flu. So our question is asking, what can we infer about what's going on right here based on this information, right? So we know that the price of eggs is a function of these two things. So what do we see here? The cost of producing eggs, corn, barley, and oats, is unchanging really from December 2023 to January 2025. So that does not change significantly, right? However, price changes significantly in that time frame. That means one of our variables, which determines price, is unchanged. That means the other variable, which can impact price, must be significantly changed, right? So as such, the only answer choice that says that is D, right? Because D says hens lost avian flu, basically the quantity of hens changed significantly, meaning egg prices are a consequence of lost hens, right? Some of these other answer choices maybe have correct pieces, but they don't answer the question all the way, right? C doesn't seem logical, right? Because, how on earth could we assume that they're likely lower? This is all sort of illogical completely. B doesn't make sense, right? Because it says feed costs are the primary determining factor in egg prices. Well, if that's the case, why on earth would they be all the same, basically, and then have egg prices be so different? And then finally, A is incorrect as well, because again, even if chicken feed is the same, if the prices of chicken eggs are going up, that means some factor is changing in the calculation that determines the price of eggs. All right, so that is how we arrive to D for this question 12. It's a really solid question. You just got to work through it methodically to get to your answer. All right, so for 13, one of the fundamental things we need to know here is what the word iconoclast means, right? If we don't know what iconoclast means, we're going to struggle here. So even though this is not a vocab question, knowing a little bit about vocab is really going to help here. So we want to challenge the claim that he was a true iconoclast. A true iconoclast means he's all on his own, unlike anyone else, doing this thing all on his own, okay? So we want to contrast or challenge that claim. So what is going to challenge that claim? It's going to show that he's not all on his own. He's not totally unique, right? A shows that. It says that although it's personal, he is inseparable from downtown New York, where all of these things were already a part of the scene there. Okay? So he's inseparable from other people and other things going on, rather than being completely separate from them. So that challenges it directly. All right? The other answer choices give examples of him being an iconoclast, right? Here's him saying, there's someone saying that he's all alone, unconnected to any tradition, that he's from a world that only he could imagine, again, saying he's all alone. And again, D saying that, all his own, right? All of those say the same thing, whereas A is the only one which says he's on his own. So he's not on his own. So you kind of have to know what iconoclast means, though I think you could probably resolve to A just by seeing that B, C, and D all say basically the same thing. So if you're missing a question like this, probably study a little bit your vocab. All right, so the question itself of 14 is really tricky. We are looking to bolster, meaning support, those that detract from the Quagga project, okay? So the people who say the Quagga project isn't legit, that's who we're looking to support, all right? So what do the people who say that this doesn't work say? They say that the true genetic makeup of the original Quagga doesn't exist in the new Quagga, right? So this new Quagga isn't actually a Quagga, its genes are wrong. So we want to see an answer choice which says that, right? Answer choice D says that. So choice D says, look, you look at the genes and old preserved Quagga specimens have very different DNA from the new selectively bred zebras that are supposed to be like Quaggas, right? So they can't be the same because their genes are different. That connects directly, oops, went out of the frame there. That connects directly with this claim here. So because those two things connect, that's how we can get D as our correct answer choice. What's wrong with some of these other ones, right? So A bolsters the position of the Quagga project, but we're trying to bolster the detractors, right? So this is an opposite distractor. This says, look, the new zebras and the Quaggas are the same. B, same thing as A, same issue as A. And then finally, C. Okay, so we have a difference in environmental adaptation, right? But are we talking about, were the other people talking about habitat adaptation or habitat preferences? No, they're talking about genetic makeup, right? So C does, support those who detract from the Quagga project, but not in the way that they want according to the text, right? That's why D is better than C here. Always go based off of what the text is saying directly rather than just making your own logical assumption. All right, 15, we got this big old graph, right? We're basically seeing how many people attend games and how long games last in the MLB. All right, so we want to support the logic, which underlined. So that means not undermined, underlined. We want to support the logic that gave the MLB the rationale to make games shorter. All right, so what we want to see, what was their rationale, right? They said that the changes would increase revenue from attendance, right? So by shortening the game, more people would come to the game. So we want to say which one shows that more people are coming to the game now that we have shorter games. Well, C. Following shortening regulations, which took place right here, as this goes down, attendance has gone up, all right? So that's a pretty clear support, okay? All these other ones are distractors, right? Game lengths in the 1990s were significantly shorter than those in the 2010s, and attendance figures were higher relative to other periods. Okay, 2010s and 1990s aren't really all that different in terms of game length. And are they really all that different in terms of attendance? Not really. Okay, so not right. Um, did attendance levels not reach previous years? Well, actually, it looks like they do. And then finally, D, highest attendance in the early 2000s, played longer than average games. No way that we can see that based on our graph. So that's how we arrive to C. All right, so 16, we have an inference question here, okay? One thing I just want you to be aware of, as you read through this passage says, logging in its current form in a certain very particular way in Wisconsin is helpful for the forestry of Wisconsin, but it wasn't always, okay? So what do we need to say here, right? The state's declining forest products industry poses a threat to forest health, right? So the decline poses a threat. Why? Well, thinning trees, which does these things, helps regenerate forests and mature faster, right? So the forest industry now plays a crucial role in maintaining healthy forests. But the forest industry is going down. So if the forest industry does a good job of helping maintain these healthy things, if the forest industry is failing, it means we'll have bad outcomes in the health, right? So that's C. We're going to see the opposite of all these things. So if they increase the overall health of state forests by having the forest industry, its decline will decrease the overall health. Why? Because right now, the forest industry helps decrease understory density, right? But without it being there, that will increase. And they help increase canopy coverage, which is a good thing. But without it, it'll diminish. Okay, so we just have to do some logical opposites here to arrive to our correct answer. Okay, if you're choosing some of these other answer choices, you might be falling into the trap of right here, loggers and paper mills devastated Wisconsin's forests, which they absolutely brutally did. But this sentence here isn't what we're referring to in the majority of this passage and isn't relevant to the logic about what's going on since 2001, right? So A would be true maybe historically, but not in this consequence. B is opposite in all the senses, right? We're going to see an increased threat to the state's forest health, right? Because it's going to be this refutes answer choice B. And then finally, D, reduced regulatory oversight isn't talked about here. So while reducing regulatory oversight would increase deforestation and clear cutting, which is what some, nefarious cretins who exist for some reason on this planet would want, they are wrong. Either way, reduced regulatory oversight is not something that's talked about in this whole section, right? It's actually maybe referred to a little bit here, but we're not losing regulation, we're losing jobs. So that's how we arrive to C for 16. All right, so 17 is our final reading question for the second module. Comes close to home, right? It's talking a little bit about La Jolla, things like that. So it's talking about why are cities closing down beaches for the sake of pinniped populations, which are seals and sea lions. Okay, so we see, typically you would do this to protect endangered species. However, these species remain stable overall. Okay, so it's not to protect endangered species. However, as a whole, however, there is a significant decline in local populations due to human harassment at places like Carpinteria and La Jolla Cove. All right, so negative human pinniped interactions, which we see up here, can lead to local losses and local issues for wildlife, which, although they are not precarious nor endangered, overall, are still seen as negative environmental consequences by local places like La Jolla and Carpinteria. What says that? D, right? So local ecological stability, right? Reducing declines, right there. Those connect right here to here. And then minimizing human wildlife conflict, which we see as we connect here. Oops. We connect here down to here. All right. And then even when species are not broadly endangered, that's where we get here. Okay. C is kind of like too extreme distractor. How do we know that they're overreacting? No idea, right? Nothing about this paragraph says that they're overreacting. You might think they're overreacting, but that's your own personal opinion. You never want to bring that to the SAT or many other places. All right. Um, Enforcing restrictions limit public access to beaches rather than for the benefit of wildlife conservation, right? That's like kind of a conspiracy theory that isn't supported within this text whatsoever. That might be coming from your own beliefs or something like that. But remember, baggage distractors we don't want to make here. And then finally, A is an opposite distractor because, right, we have stable populations. Okay, so they're not trying to save endangered seals or sea lions. Rather, they're doing the opposite. They're trying to help out local populations that are troubled, even if overall the populations are very stable. So that's how you arrive to D. And then we'll move on to the end of the test here after that. All right, so question 18, we have a punctuation question asking us about possession and number. All right, so I'm just going to go through and reveal why each question or each answer choice is wrong or right. So A and B are both wrong because ones without the apostrophe means that there's just more than one. All right, now that kind of sounds confusing, right? But the only time I could see that working is you're talking about having like multiple, George Washington dollar bills, and you're like, I got a lot of ones in my pocket, or I've got a lot of ones in a card game, something like that. But here, one is referring to oneself, right? One person's friends or whatever. Okay, so ones without the apostrophe doesn't work. So that leaves us between C and D. And now we're looking between what's the only difference? Friend singular apostrophe S or friends plural apostrophe. All right. Why do we know that friends is plural? Right. We see these tight-knit circles. Um, we see writers, painters, and poets. Okay, so we see that we are talking about a group here. So the friends that a person makes, or the influence of a person's friends group, determined artistic success. All right, so that's why we can eliminate singular choice friend and go with plural friend possessive because friends own ideas and connections, and singular possessive one because there's only one person who has the friend or friends. All right, 19 is kind of an exaggerated form of one of our classic SAT verb tense subject verb agreement questions. All right, basically, what they love to do is put our subject really far away from our verb so that everything in between can make us think, this is what is determining our verb's tense. But really, this is what determines our verb's tense. All right, so the Medici family is singular. All right. The Medici, and that's another thing that the SAT loves to do. They love to ask questions about those singular nouns, which seem like they should be plural. I'm talking about a team, a company, a country, a family. Notice we don't say, uh, you know, like, more than one, right? Like family is singular, right? So a single family. Um, because Medici family is singular, that means that we have to be in the singular, right? Um, that's basically what we get, right? Endure doesn't work because uh, we have it in the plural. Have endured doesn't work because have is also in the plural, right? If it said has endured, it might work. And are enduring, again, we have the plural. So that's how we arrive to be as our correct answer. What makes this difficult? Wanting to look at all of this, which doesn't even matter. Now, that doesn't mean we don't read the whole text, because there are many SAT questions, like you saw in the first module, where not reading the whole text is why you get it wrong. You just have to read the whole thing every single time and then find out what context actually matters every single time. That's how you're going to succeed. Repeating the same process every time, figuring out what matters. That's how you arrive at the correct answer of B. All right, so question 20 here is one of our typical, most difficult punctuation questions we'll see on the SAT. Why is it difficult? Well, it's testing multiple things. We have creating a list with semicolons. We have the unclear issue of when we use a colon to start a list, and all sorts of things, okay? So first things first, let's go through what's wrong. Why is A wrong? A is wrong because of this colon here. When can we use a colon? We can only use a colon when it comes after something that can be a complete sentence. Is this a complete sentence? Studios and independent animators rely on a range of methods, including. Could you end a sentence at including there like that? No. So you could not put a colon there because a colon basically is a period, which just gives the rest of the information. All right. Now, why is B wrong? B is wrong because we're using only commas to separate our items in the list, which suggests that which captures frame by frame movements of physical models is its own item in the list. But it's not its own item in the list, right? Which captures frame by frame movements of physical models describes stop motion animation. Stop motion animation is the item in the list. So you can't use just commas to separate the items in the list because it makes it unclear what's in our list. We have to use semicolons to separate our items in the list, right? Finally, what's wrong with C? C has this useless, unnecessary comma right there, all right? We don't want that comma. And then we also have a comma here after using semicolons all the way through. So these two commas suggest that from traditional to models is a non-essential phrase, right? But it's not. You couldn't say the sentence as rely on a range of methods, including and CGI. That doesn't make any sense. So why does D work? Well, we don't use a comma to introduce our list. We don't use a colon to introduce our list because we don't need to given the format of our passage. All right. And then we have semicolons, which are separating the specific items in our list because one of our items in the list requires a comma. That is every step correct and how we arrive to D as our correct answer. If you're missing this, you're probably not being methodical or rigorous enough in your application of your punctuation knowledge, or you need to review your punctuation knowledge a little bit. All right, so question 21 here is a little bit nitpicky, I'll admit. Okay, it is valid, but I think that the SAT maybe would make our distractors a little easier on a question like this. Okay, so if you're missing a question like 21, though, the first thing you should do is review your tense sheet. Okay, remember, tense clarifies meaning. Your tense sheet is something that should have been provided for you in class or by your teacher or by your tutor or whoever. If you don't yet have access to a tense sheet, ask someone at Hamilton Education for one. Okay. Now, what tense do we have going on here in our correct answer choice? Right. This is the future perfect progressive. The future perfect progressive. Now, what does that mean? It's an action that will be completed by some point in the future. Okay. So it will have been sitting. Now, will have sat and will have been sitting, you might think to yourself, are, relatively similar, right? And they are. What is the difference between the two? Okay. Will have sat means that it's no longer sitting in the future that we're describing, the hypothetical future that we're describing. It's no longer sitting there, right? It will have sat beneath the ground for an entire century, okay? When the thing rolls around. Uh, but will have been sitting means it's still there and it's going to then do something else, right? It's an item in the future that will be completed in the future, and we know when it's going to be completed in the future, right? Uh, and it's kind of ongoing all the time, right? It's going to be sitting there at the time we arrive to 2085. Okay. It will be sitting beneath the ground for an entire century. Doesn't include the fact that it's in the future, but at the point in the future we arrive to, everything before it will have been in the past. Okay. And it will sit beneath the ground for an entire century is something we could have said in 1985, but now no longer makes any sense. Okay. So if you selected B here, I'll admit you're doing okay. This is a little crazy nitpicky compared to what the SAT normally asks. But it's valid that C is better than B because C suggests that this is something in the future that will end, but at the time is ongoing at the same time. It is ongoing, about to end in the future. That's what this tense signifies, which again is the future perfect progressive. All right. With that, that's how you arrive to C. Study your tense table and study how tense informs meaning. All right, 22 is a really great example of one of our most tricky verb tense type questions we'll see on the SAT. So why is this so tricky? Typically, the subject that determines the case of our verb comes before the verb, right? So we would say, Rio is my teacher, right? Is the verb and Rio is the subject, right? But sometimes the subject of the sentence will come after our verb. And when that happens, it can be difficult to determine what actually our subject is. So, what is our subject here? What is difficult in terms of classification? The platypus and the echidna, right? These two things, little critters, are difficult to classify, okay? So that means, are we going to be talking about a singular subject or a plural subject? It's going to have to be a plural subject, all right? So he has been, or it has been, right? That would have been correct if we were just talking about the platypus. But are we just talking about the platypus? No, we're talking about the platypus and the echidna. Had been doesn't make sense because they are still difficult to classify, right? It is still a subject of debate. Because it's still a subject of debate, it's not something that's done. But then is means that it is right now and not in the past, whereas have been means that it's something that began in the past but is ongoing until now, which is exactly the tense we want, right? So both number and time are difficult on this. If you're missing a question like this, I'd recommend you study our tense sheet. Really look into tense as a way of trying to make sense of some of this. But this is a really tricky question. If you miss this, I totally understand that this is a difficult one. Right, 23, we have a transitions question. I think that this one is kind of tricky because the correct answer doesn't sound like our typical transition, right? But remember, with transitions, we're really just thinking, what's the logical, like, connection between our two bits of information? And here, right, we have all of this information about how difficult it was to try to make this amazing album smile, this really ambitious thing that he wasn't able to accomplish, all the things that stood in the way, but then that ultimately, luckily, thank God, he's able to finish it in 2004. Okay, so conversely doesn't make sense because it would pivot from what came before to what came last, right? It would undermine the previous claim, and this isn't undermining the previous claim, even if there's a slight pivot or difference. Okay, hence means therefore. Does this all make sense to say, therefore, he made it decades later? No. All right. Mercifully works because it shows the kind of connotation we want of a Thank goodness that this all took place, right? Luckily, a summary type situation. Then moreover would be just listing additional information in line with the previous claim. But the previous claim is how difficult it was. Moreover doesn't make sense here because we're not giving more information about how difficult it was. So if you're missing this, study those transitions categories. That's how we arrived at mercifully. All right, so 24 is a tricky, difficult transitions question because there's a bit of a baggage distractor here, which remember is when we use outside information to inform our understanding. If you're missing this question, I suggest you watch the video for 23 on Module 1. That'll really help you with overall transitions questions. But right here, we want to think about what's the logical relationship between these two parts. Here, we're just saying, look, online sports gambling has grown. Then here we pivot to say, however, this growth has led to significant issues among young men and boys. All right. So sports gambling has grown a lot, but it has caused these issues. Okay. So how is there a baggage distractor here? All of us probably know that sports gambling is gonna cause problems for young men and boys, right? There's been a lot of suicide as a result of this, right? It's a horrible thing, and these sports gambling agencies are foul, disgusting behemoths, right? And we all should know this. And if you don't know this, I don't know what's up with you. Something. Um, so it might naturally seem that an answer choice like A or B would work here because that's a cause and effect. That means this is the cause and this is the outcome, and that's a natural relationship. However, nothing in this passage before there says, clearly sports gambling is going to be the cause of these naturally bad outcomes, right? That's why instead we need a pivoting transition, like a however or a that said, right? Because we're showing all the things of growth, and growth is typically seen as a positive. However, there are downsides to this growth. Moreover, however, doesn't work because typically moreover just works to add additional information to a previous claim or thought. And here we don't have that. So that is why D works here. If you're missing this, this is a tough transitions question for sure. Really just buckle in on studying those transitions categories and making sense of it. All right, 25 is the final transitions question on the test. It's a really tricky one because you have to navigate a lot of kind of logically difficult information in our first few sentences about probably one of the three greatest philosophers of all time, Baruch Spinoza. Brilliant, the best, okay? So what is the relationship between this logical bit and this logical bit? All right, basically all of this clarifies what it came before. Right? By clarifying it, in other words, works great, right? It's restating in a new, more straightforward way everything that came before. Okay? Moreover would mean giving another example of what came before, right? So what came before, saying that he doesn't fit neatly into the box of being religious or a pantheist, nor does he fit into the box of atheism, right? He's kind of hard to pin down. Moreover, would just explain that or wouldn't explain that, but give another example. But this isn't another example, it's a restatement. Admittedly would be a concession, right? It would be something that concedes or refutes a little bit of what was said before, but that isn't what we have here. Finally, meanwhile would mean something happening at the same time, which we don't have either. How do we know that we're restating this? So this says that he's hard to pin down, atheist, pantheist. And here it says that he doesn't fit neatly into either. Instead, offering a version of divinity that is deeply reverent, yet rejects a personal God. So, God, he's so good. Spinoza, check him out. Anyways, that's how we arrived at C for 25. Okay, for 26, we have a question about controlled burns. This is a rhetorical synthesis question. We really want to just make sure that our answer choices and our question are in alignment and that the answer choices answer the question and they also use correct information from the passage, right? So what's wrong with our incorrect answer choices. So first, let's look at why D is wrong. D is a too extreme distractor, right? It should be abandoned in favor of strict wildfire suppression policies. That doesn't seem to be the case here, right? That is a too extreme distractor and is refuted by this claim here. Okay, C is opposite distractor because, again, of this claim here. Okay, why is B correct? Well, B answers the question, right? The ecological benefits of controlled burns, but addresses some concerns, right? So what are the concerns? Air pollution and habitat disruption, which we see here, air pollution, habitat disruption. But then we see mostly the benefits, right? What are the benefits? Reducing wildfire risk, and ecosystem health, right over here. So nothing wrong with B. Finally, A, we see that they're controversial, but here there's an extreme distractor. All wildfires from occurring and ensure that they remain untouched by fire. That's too extreme, not supported in the text. So just make sure that your text supports your answer and your answer answers the question. And that's how we get our correct answer of B. All right, 27 is probably the most cool rhetorical synthesis question ever. It's wanting to apply the framework of existentialism as a humanism, which is the Sartre piece that the notes are about, to the context of decision making. So how can we make decisions that are in alignment with what Sartre says in existentialism as a humanism? All right, so let's make sure, so we know what we are trying to answer, so let's make sure that our answer is supported by the text. Okay, so what's wrong with A? A person should follow the moral code set by their society as they provide objective guidelines for ethical decision making. All right, that doesn't seem supported in this situation, right? Because he rejects moral absolutes, right? So that values are created through actions, okay? And that there's no claim that following what is suggested by society is what we must do, rather that we must engage in a radical freedom and determine things for ourselves. Okay, so A is not supported in the text whatsoever. B is wrong because of this here. One can act without responsibility, right? That is not true because of this claim here, right? He says that people cannot escape responsibility for their choices. And therefore we must act authentically, taking responsibility rather than making arbitrary or careless decisions. All right, so that refutes this part. So that is why B is incorrect according to the text. All right, let's see why D is incorrect according to the text, since we know that C is the correct answer. All right, so one's destiny is largely shaped by external forces. I'm not sure if that's stated anywhere in particular here. Though external forces is mentioned, it isn't that we're finding that, but that individuals can still find meaning by embracing roles assigned to them by society. Do we see that anywhere? No, you don't see much reference to aligning with society in any of these. So we can get rid of D. So why is C correct? So individuals must recognize that their choices define them, right? Here we go. That one's choices define not only oneself, but also set an example for humanity, right? And then also that they must take full responsibility for their actions. Why must they take full responsibility for their actions? We see right here. We must take responsibility because we cannot rely on external justification such as fate, God, or human nature. So all of those are accurately, positively stated within the notes, whereas none of the other answer choices either use the notes correctly or use the notes at all. So that's how we arrive to C here on this really cool rhetorical synthesis question. With that, we come to the end of our test. Thanks for following through all of these, and hopefully this was of service.